The LA Times and Washington Post declined to endorse either presidential candidate. But does anyone really care? Here to discuss is Blaze senior politics editor Chris Bedford. He wrote about this in his latest Beltway brief. But Chris, I look at this and isn't this a little bit of foreshadowing? Doesn't this indicate good things for Donald Trump if the leftist organizations aren't out there endorsing Kamala Harris?
Well, yes, on multiple fronts. One, not endorsing a candidate, doesn't really matter these days. There's literally no one who was waiting for the LA Times or the Washington Post endorsement to decide who to vote for. The only people who were waiting for this were the editorial writers who were so obsessed with their own point of view and so convinced that the world just hangs on their every word, despite 8 years of evidence being compiled in every single interaction they've had with the public to the contrary, that they're angry. So they're quitting en masse, which is really a wonderful thing to see, because the world definitely needs plenty of unemployed Washington Post and L.A. Times editorial writers who attack their bosses. That's exactly the kind of thing that a newspaper is looking to publish, and I'm being sarcastic on that front. But even more than that, they're also not endorsing Kamala Harris. They're kind of hedging their bets. They're saying, well, maybe we're not going to use our firepower. And something about that tells me that the publishers and the owners who have made this decision are simply sick of 8 years of temper tantrums from their employees. And to show this, they've said, we're not going to endorse. We're just going to stay back. And they've been greeted with more and more temper tantrums. And I think this is a little foreshadowing to, if Kamala Harris loses the election, despite massively outspending her opponent, despite indicting her opponent and trying to put her opponent in prison, despite multiple assassination attempts on her opponent, despite impeaching her opponent for completely ridiculous and scurrilous accusations, despite actually successfully, I think it might have been a little rigged, but successfully unelecting her opponent, she still actually can't beat him. So if she loses this election in 8 days now, this kind of turning on the publishers, turning on Bezos, turning on the owner of the LA Times, turning on each other is kind of a foreshadowing of the Democrat civil war that you're going to see. Maybe these folks aren't going to take it lying down. Their power has been decreasing every single day. The more they attack Donald Trump, the higher his popularity goes. But as opposed to looking outward or even inward and saying, where is his popularity coming from and where have we gone wrong? They're kind of circling around a firing squad to turn on each other. And well, I think that's good news for everyone except for them.
Yeah. Just want to remind people that if they want to read the full article for this or get Bedford's newsletter in their email box, they can go to theblaze.com/Bedford. Bedford never likes to give you that actual URL. So figured I'd give it for you. But what's interesting to me about this...
We'll let you come back if you do that more often, Rob. That's good.
There we go. What's interesting to me, though, is it seems like people in the media don't think that they actually have bosses. And I think you kind of alluded to that, right? They're always like, I can't believe that the owner of the paper is making an editorial decision. Like the person that owns the ink has no say in the newspaper, that it's only the reporters and the people there. But I think that that's kind of a entitlement thing for the entire left, right? They don't think that they have to answer to anybody. And you alluded to a civil war. Where else besides just, the media rooms do you think you'll see these sorts of things? Is it going to be nonprofits that might realize that, we need to get more conservative voices or we need to be more nonpartisan? Because the biggest joke is that a nonpartisan outlet is, actually nonpartisan.
Oh, you're totally right on a publisher actually having a say in newspapers. The idea that publishers don't have a say in newspapers is ahistorical in every aspect. We used to annoy our old boss, the Daily Caller, Neil Patel, by calling him the Colonel because he had a fairly iron hand sometimes in different editorial affairs or different things around the company. But we took that nickname from the old head of the Chicago Tribune, the owner, called the Colonel, who was known for calling down to reporters and making decisions or making calls and saying, here's where I want you to be covered. Here's where I want your coverage. It's only in very modern times reporters, and these reporters don't have a lot of history. You can kind of tell that from the fact that they compare everything to Hitler and antebellum slavery without any real historical aspect. They don't actually understand anything about history. They don't even know the history of their own outlets. They don't know the way that this has gone. And the publisher of the Washington Post made that point when he said, we didn't used to make endorsements. It's only in the modern era we've made endorsements. Or endorsements only hurt our ability to be actually fair. They don't make it better, so we're no longer going to do them. And they want to launch the Civil War because over the last 8 years, they have turned every aspect, not just the editorial aspect, but also the business aspect, the advertising aspect, the money-making aspects, into part of their kind of crusade to get them into their heroic status that they imagine themselves as French resistance fighters or whatever they have when they march around their bedrooms in their berets at night. And the same thing is going to be true about the nonprofits. Nonprofits and the left, which are massive, they blow away right-wing nonprofits. Their funders on the left take it very seriously. People on the right should take notice, by the way, because they're extremely efficient at this. But they have been hobbled in the last couple of years by a new generation of revolutionaries who are overtaking their bosses, constantly sensing microaggressions, constantly demanding that they take different stances, which maybe the Gen Zers in their lower levels of staff and HR departments think are necessary, but they're not moving voters. They're not changing laws in the way that they could be. They've been crippling the left wing's nonprofits. So what we've seen over this last decade is essentially a woke revolution. And don't buy into that kind of framing that this is just a pendulum that's going to swing back. It gets worse and worse every year because the ground they take is not surrendered often. It's rarely surrendered. They move the Overton window. Decisions are made. People are afraid to speak out in this country in a way that we haven't seen in modern times about their politics. But the actual fervor of this revolution is burning out. It's kind of like, reminds me almost like of a nonviolent version of the French Revolution, where people started to look around after a while and said, well, who came up with this idea? Why did we turn on so many of our colleagues? Why did we turn on so many people who should have been our allies? They've been doing that for years. It's hobbled them. And if they do lose this election, which I think is looking more and more likely each day, then they're going to turn on those folks who made those decisions. And those revolutionary types, they're just going to give up. It's not going to be easy. You're going to see a civil war in the Democratic Party. We've already started to see it with people lining up against the squad, Democratic primaries. You're going to see that intensify to a degree that we're not used to. Usually, Republicans are the ones shooting each other. But now I think Democrats' party discipline is going to start to break down.
Well, Chris, you talk about Donald Trump is Hitler, and they tried to say that his rally at Madison Square Garden yesterday, there was a pro-Nazi rally. But we know that's false. We know that's not how things went. It felt more like a second RNC to me. Chris, did you get that feeling with some of the similar people that were on stage? Just the way that they made this an entire experience at MSG yesterday.
Yes, and Madison Square Garden has 80 years of history of hosting massive events. Young Americans for Freedom's first national event was at Madison Square Garden. I think it was in 1961. They absolutely packed the place with people who are supporters of Barry Goldwater and other conservatives. They pack it for sporting events. But this is the first time in decades I have seen it packed for a political conference, and it wasn't even one where they had to lie and pretend that Beyonce was going to be giving a concert. All these people came not for the early speakers, but for Donald Trump, and they left absolutely thrilled. And yes, I mean, these are people even more so than the RNC, which I had the fun of covering for the Blaze. A lot more normal people in this crowd, a lot more people who just brought their kids out to see a piece of history, to cheer it on. And for the media to go back and say, well, actually, these are Nazis, because Madison Square Garden, a very ugly but iconic American stadium, is somehow associated with the Nazis. That's not true. It doesn't make sense. It's not convincing voters.
Has anybody told the resident artist of the Madison Square Garden, Billy Joel, who I think is Jewish, that it's a Nazi haven? Which gets me to the point. There was a Holocaust survivor who flew in from Israel, and I think this is the guy that made the joke, hey, I just got off the plane from Israel and I thought I'd go to a Nazi rally, joking about it. And the media says, guy comes and admits that it's a Nazi rally. I mean, the amount of just snippets that they've been able to take out of context from this rally really goes to what we were talking about before, just how the media twists everything and doesn't give anybody context to what's being said.
Yes, they rolled right over the fact that there was literally a Holocaust survivor there. They rolled right over the fact that there were Hasidic Jews in attendance and Orthodox Jews and other observant Jews. And of course, because they are so historically literate, they rolled over the fact that there was a large Catholic presence. You know, people don't realize, a lot of leftists don't realize this. You went to concentration camps if you're an observant Catholic in the Third Reich. It wasn't some kind of Christian thing. It was a neo-pagan death cult. It was a complete aberration. That's why it's so interesting in European history as compared to all the other slaughters, is because it was so outside of the norm. They took over the churches. They imprisoned priests. They made martyrs. They made saints. A lot that gypsies were imprisoned. This was not that. This was among the most multi-ethnic gathering that you've seen of the Republican Party in decades, because it's people who look at the Democratic Party, they don't see a home, they look at Donald Trump, they see someone who's speaking to their needs, their worries, their desires, and also, I think this is a main thing, this is why he's a big attraction, is giving it back to the people who have messed with them, with a system that is generally not answering their needs, who's punching it right in the face, who's him and JD Vance, they're going on, they're telling Jake Tapper that he's absolutely full of it, right to his smug little face. And they love that. It's fantastic. And it's a show. It's the kind of, I have friends who brought their children up to go see this because it's a family friendly and fun event.